In today's video, we're going to do animal fur in watercolor pencils. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel we do all things watercolor, including watercolor pencils like today's video, some drawing techniques, even a little bit of mixed media and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. Unlike many channels on YouTube, we are fully cat approved and we'd love to have you join us. Now, I love watercolor pencils for texture, particularly things like hair and fur and leaf veins, anything where you need that linear texture. They're really, really fantastic. So today we're going to look at animal fur. We'll go through some different techniques, how to get sort of fluffy animal fur and smooth animal fur, how to get a really realistic texture on your animals that you're painting. We're even going to look at a little bit of color mixing, particularly those difficult black animals like Mr. Gimlet, who's asleep upstairs in his basket at the moment. Black fur can be really, really difficult. You'll be amazed how much color there actually is in black fur. Now, in this video, I will be using a little bit of pure watercolor paint, but don't worry if you've only got watercolor pencils. I'm going to show you a hack that will sort that out right now. Now, if there's one disadvantage to watercolor pencils is that they sometimes leave lines when you want a really smooth effect. So just occasionally it's worth turning them into paint before you start, or using ordinary watercolor paint. So before we start today's video in full, I'm just going to show you how to do that. So here's my watercolor pencil. Now, I've got this Caran palette. This is specially designed for turning watercolor pencils into paint. Don't worry if you haven't got one of these. I'll show you an alternative in a moment. It's got a slight texture to it. So we're just going to draw on it like this, activate it with water, and now my watercolor pencils are turned into paint and there's absolutely no chance of lines being left behind. So this is just occasionally when you want a really smooth effect, perhaps for an underwash. So maybe you don't have one of these very posh palettes. Let me show you what you can do instead. You can simply use a textured piece of watercolor paper. This is going to work too. The only reason the palette is a little bit better is that some of the colour is obviously going to sink into this paper, so you get all of the colour activated if you use that plastic palette. But this works absolutely splendidly as well. So if during this video you see me using any ordinary paint alongside my watercolours, you don't have ordinary watercolour paint, you just have watercolour pencils, this is what you do. Let's talk about underwashes and bleeding and soft versus hard edges, because most animals have areas where they are fluffy and areas where they're smooth. Let's look at how to achieve this first. Later in this video we'll look at colour choices, but first we're going to look at some base techniques because it can be very daunting. I've got some sort of bits of cats here, shall we say, and you know, there's just so much. Where do you even start? So what we're going to start with is an underwash, and let's look at the brushes that we are going to use. So if you've just got a standard watercolor brush like one of these, that's fine. You can do the whole thing with this. There are a couple of brushes that are going to help a little bit. A flat brush like this can be good for spreading water, but as I said, it's not a necessity. And then later on, I'm going to use some really scruffy, rough acrylic brushes with jagged edges. These are incredibly cheap and you can cut into them with something like nail scissors to make them even more ragged. So let's look at the idea of an underwash and particularly the outside edge. Now, the edges of animals vary. They can be very soft and fluffy. We've got this edge here, or they can be a lot more hard edged, and even this cat has got some floof to it, whereas, you know, something like a Labrador dog, something like that, would be very smooth indeed. So when we do an underwash to go under all the fur, we want to consider really, do we want hard edges or do we want soft edges? Chances are we'll want a bit of both on the same animal. Even a very smooth cat, for example, may have some fluff around the edges of the face. Now, if we just do our underwash with a hard edge, it's amazing. Even in a pale colour, it's really hard to get rid of that hard line around the edge. It's always going to show. So what we can do is we can add some water to get soft edges, or add no water for hard edges. So let me show you. So let's say I have sketched an animal and he's got quite a hard edge to his fur, and then He's got some softness around this area. As I said at the beginning of the video, I'm going to use paint for this bit, but you can just turn your watercolor pencil into paint to do your underwash with. Now I'm going to add some water here. I would tend to use a flat brush like this one. If only I had cleaned it, it wouldn't be blue. Where did that come from? Dear oh dear, I always clean my paintbrushes as well. Now I've also got some paper towel, which I can use not only to dry my brush, but I'm just going to get rid of some of that colour there. It's probably a little bit of phthalo something or other. So we've now got a wet area here, but we haven't got puddles. If I go in with my underwash, let's make that colour a little bit lighter. I can choose whether I want a hard edge like this, or where I hit that water, I'll get a softer edge. So I can choose as I go round the edge of my animal between hard or soft. But what if I've got an area that's going to be really, really fluffy? We can sort of get ahead of ourselves and make that area even more fluffy. And the way we do that, because you see at the moment the water outside is wetter, so it's almost bleeding into the animal's fur area. But if I put some wet paint along here, what will happen is as it dries, it will start to bleed outwards. So wet always goes to less wet. So if this is damp and this paint inside is wet, then it will bleed outwards and we'll get this fluffiness appearing. I can also use a slightly drier paintbrush if I want to start to lift out any lighter areas. I wouldn't necessarily go too dark with an underwash anyway, but the first thing you want to look at is which area of your animal is hard, which area is soft and fluffy, and start your underwash with that in mind. Watercolor pencils are great for texture, but we're going to add something else as well. We're going to use an embossing tool. Don't worry if you don't have one. I guarantee there's something around your house that you can use. And this is a great method of adding texture, extra texture to your fur. So let's do this next. Our watercolor pencils are going to give us lots of linear texture, but the more we can build this up, the better. And so we're going to layer until we get that real feeling of fur texture. And one of the things you can do before you go in with the watercolor pencils, as you do your underwash, is you can do some embossing. So I have some embossing tools here. This one has a small point and a large point. You can see that they are just metal points with a little ball on the end. That's so they don't cut the paper. It is possible to use a scalpel blade for this. You may have seen that in some of my other videos. I've also got this, I think it's X-Acto pen here, which also does the same thing. And just like one of those multicolored ballpoint pens you had as a kid, you can change the ends. However, you do not need a special embossing tool. Nail art tools are pretty much identical to this. They can be grabbed cheaply. You can use a ballpoint pen that's run out of ink. You can use the end of a small paintbrush, anything at all that's going to make a dent in your paper. The wider it is, of course, the wider the strokes will appear. Now, you can go into the paper first of all with the embossing tool, but another thing you can do, which often works a little bit more effectively, is that you can draw into wet paint and we can start to get a fur texture appearing. Now, it's really important with this that you don't just scribble. You need to go in the direction that the fur is growing, and you want to go outwards from root to tip. Just like drawing with a pencil, what will happen then is you'll get a tapered line that's going to look very, very realistic indeed. This gives us our underneath layer, which we can then work on top of. Let's look at colour choices, including that very difficult black fur. Let's look now at choosing colours. Now, I've got a white pencil here. The difficulty with white watercolour pencils is they're not very opaque. It can be hard to get, you know, some pure white hairs, such as we would see here. You can, of course, leave white areas as you apply your underwash. That's a great thing to do. There are many types of watercolour painting where it just isn't necessary to use white, but to my mind, a white paint really is essential for painting fur. So in addition to my pencils, I'm going to be using this titanium white. There are two types of watercolour white you can get, zinc or Chinese white. Chinese white is just zinced white usually, although some brands will have a mix between titanium and zinc in a watercolor. The titanium is the more opaque one. Now, because this is a water-soluble paint, it's not going to go on white and just sit there. It's going to pick up some of the other colors around it as well, which means that not only can you get pure white hairs, but you can also get a lovely subtle blended effect. You can also get very opaque creamy colors by mixing a little white in. Let's look now at our watercolor pencils. So I've got different types of brown and beige and red brown in here. I've also got black. So let's swatch some of these colors. So I've got a black here. I'll put some water on these in a moment. I've got cool browns. You can also pick up grays. Obviously, it's going to depend on the animal that you're working with, but they never just have one color. Even, you know, a jet black cat will have other colors. So I've got a dark gray here, a lighter gray. A color like this one here is very useful because it's somewhere between a gray and a brown. If you only have a small range of colors, of course you can layer them together and mix new colors. Got a whole selection of warmer colors. Yellow ochre is very useful. If you have an animal with a lot of red in its fur, this pencil is just labeled Russet, but we're looking at something like an oxide red there. This one is labeled light flesh, but it looks to me very much like some kind of sienna, or one of the more opaque yellows like Naples yellow. Looks very much like a Naples yellow to me. We have a burnt ochre here, and then this one's just labeled earth. So that's very much like a sepia color. So I'll wet these first, and then I'll explain why I have these other sort of non-fur colors on hand. So starting with the lighter colors, I'm not worrying too much about cleaning my brush too much here. I just want you to get an idea of the color palette that you need for fur. These all came out of the same set. You'll find all of the colors listed in the video description if you're interested in these. So we can pretty much paint any fur with these and the addition of white. Why do I have these colors here? Now I've got a purple, a pink, and a warm blue, an ultramarine. And you could also, in some circumstances, use a phthalo blue. Now you can see here the way this cat's fur has caught the light. Isn't it beautiful? We have blues in there and we have purples. So with any black animal, you're likely to find some blue if it's a very deep black. Alternatively, with a lot of cats, what you'll find is they've got quite a lot of brown in their fur. My own cat, Mr. Gimlet, when he lays in the sun, he looks so brown. He is getting old, of course, like myself. The hair lightens a little as we get older. So we can use a warm, or even in some circumstances, a cool blue. Be careful with a cool blue, because if you add a cool blue to anything that's got yellow in, you're likely to end up perhaps with a little bit of green by accident, which is why sometimes an ultramarine blue is more useful. We can get those very subtle animal fur colors. Now I've got here a violet, and I've also got a pink. This one's labeled purplish red, but it's a crimson color basically. So what can happen when you're working with this range of colors is you can accidentally get green. Now when would this happen? Let's see if we can make it happen. So I've got a very blue grey here. So we know that it's got, you know, a fair amount of blue in it. And here I've got some yellow ochre. So I have two neutral shades, one of which has a lot of yellow in and one of which has a lot of blue in. So it's not beyond the realms of expectation that when these two mix together, they may accidentally go a little bit on the greenish side, as they have. So what we can do is we can add either purple, or we can add, and if it's a bit sort of yellowish, you want to add the purple. If it's more greenish, we can add some pink. So the pink is just there to neutralize the green. So if we mix this in, we start to cool that color back down and we lose the green. Now we've sorted out these underneath layers, we're going to start layering in with our linear pencil marks. So when you're working up fur, it's important that you'll need to work in multiple layers. This is going to give the fur some density and the texture that you're looking for. Now here's an underwash that I did earlier. You can see I made this soft edge up here and I did some embossing. So it's ready to go in with our watercolor pencils now. It's important to think about if your watercolor pencil is quite sharp or if it's blunt. Neither is wrong, but be aware that you'll get softer, less defined lines if you've got a blunter pencil. You'll also put more pigment on the paper. If you're looking for sharper lines, you may end up wanting to sharpen your pencil more. Now again, it's important that you apply these in the direction that the fur is growing, and always looking back. Obviously I've just made this part of a creature up, but always looking back at where the fur is clumping. Now there will be some areas where you can't actually see every hair, and we'll look at that in a moment. But to start with, we're just going to apply in strokes like this. I'm going on to dry paper here, which is one option. Another option is to go onto wet paper. Now I don't want a wet part here really, unless it's something like under the animal's chin where a line might be somewhat hidden. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back round with my clean water here and come down into the area where I'm working. And you will have to work in sections because it's impossible to work on the whole thing at once. So you want to look for areas that naturally have a break in. You might work on an ear, you might work on the lower part of the face. And what we can do here is we can go in again, and we'll get slightly more pigment being released when we're working on wet paper. Again, building up lots of different colours and strokes. I may show you 3 layers today. That doesn't mean you can't go in with 10 or 12. As long as you're on a good quality paper, you should be able to keep working in layers, and all it's going to do is just add to that natural feeling of building things up. I'm going to let this dry now, and then I'll show you how to go in with the white paint, and finally how to make some softer areas where you can't see every individual piece of fur and perhaps the animal is in some shadow. Just before we carry on with today's tutorial, I'd like to ask you if you could possibly like this video. Liking, sharing, subscribing or leaving comments all helps to push this channel out to more people. I recently passed 150,000 subscribers. So grateful to all of you who watch me here on YouTube. Now, if you love watercolor pencils and you also love flowers, you might be interested in my watercolor pencil flower painting course. Unlike some of my online courses, which are particularly about techniques, this one is actually a set of tutorials, so you can go through, I think it's 8 full-length tutorials with me where you paint some beautiful watercolor flowers. If you're interested in this, I will leave the link in the video description. You're not committing to anything by clicking that link. You can just have a look at the course. You can look at prices, reviews, even see other people's results and see if it's right for you. Now let's get back to today's tutorial. Let's look next at what causes fur to look shiny and how we can achieve that in our paintings. So I've got some white paint here, and I've got my scruffier, stiffer brushes. Now, when you go in with this, you want to use, you don't have to use no water, but use as little water as possible. Otherwise, you'll just be basically putting white paint on top. It's also a good idea to, get rid of some first. And then what we're aiming for is this dry brush effect, whereby we end up sweeping down and getting these white highlights where we need them. Now, remember, you won't use any of these layers in isolation. The idea is to keep building up with multiple layers. Now, when you look at an animal, you'll see lots of fur texture, but not everything is really up close in full focus. Not unless you're about 2 inches away, and certainly with Mr. Gimlet, that's a very, very dangerous place to put your face. So we like to keep our distance a little bit, particularly if he's grumpy and hasn't been fed. So I'm going to show you next how to blend some areas of your fur to get soft, natural effects, so that in some areas you can see the texture and other areas are soft and blended. Now finally, we'll end up with areas where we can see every hair, and then other areas that fade out. Now the photographer on here has obviously, caused some of these areas to fade into the distance, but this naturally happens anyway due to perspective, and also due to areas like perhaps underneath the chin being in shadow. Also fur that's softer and fluffier will be less likely to show individual hairs, as will shorter hair. So as we go through our process of working onto the fur, we can, if we want to, in places take a brush across the top, and either with clean water like this or with a little colour, perhaps to get areas of shadow, we can start taking some areas into less definition. And remember, don't panic. If you blend too much, just allow it to dry. You can take more texture back on top, both with the dry brush technique and also just by adding in more watercolor pencil. Now, if you want to know more about the materials I used today or any of the other videos that I mentioned in this video, I'll leave all of that information in the video description. You also want to pop down there because you can grab some free PDFs. There's even 1 or 2 free courses that you can take. Don't forget, I also have that watercolor pencil flower painting course, and coming up later, I mean, it depends, I say later, depends when you're watching this video, but at the time that I'm making it later this spring, that spring of 2024, probably end of May, I'm going to have a full brand new watercolor flower painting course. So excited about this one. You all know it's my favorite subject. So don't forget to have a look in that video description. Meantime, if you enjoyed this watercolor pencils video, I think you're going to find this next one really interesting too.